July 30th, 1975. Massa's Red Fox Restaurant, Bloomfield Township, Michigan. Jimmy Hoffa checks his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. 2:30 in the afternoon, and the men he's supposed to meet haven't shown. His green 1975 Pontiac Granville sits alone in the parking lot, engine ticking as it cools under the summer sun. Anthony Giacalone was the man who set the meeting, and Hoffa expected him there, along with Anthony Provenzano. But the parking lot stays empty, and within the hour, the most powerful labor leader in American history will simply vanish, dissolved into a criminal empire so disciplined, so calculating, that it would operate for another 2 decades before federal prosecutors finally penetrated its structure. But this ending, this perfect disappearance, was built on 50 years of strategy that began not with violence, but with silence. While Al Capone's Chicago erupted in machine gun fire and Lucky Luciano's New York drowned in blood feuds, Detroit's Mafia became something entirely different. They built one of the most stable and enduring crime families in American history by mastering a single principle: control the border, control the money, and outlast everyone stupid enough to fight wars they didn't need to win. The story begins not with power, but with poverty, with waves of Sicilian immigrants who crossed an ocean only to find themselves trapped in a new kind of cage. Detroit, 1903, Eastern Market District. The smell of rotting produce mingles with coal smoke and desperation. Italian fruit vendors and laborers from Castellammare del Golfo find letters slipped under their doors at dawn. No stamps, no return addresses, just messages written in Sicilian dialect and black handprints pressed in ink at the bottom. The demands are simple: $50 by Friday or the cart burns. Then the shop. Then, if they're stubborn, their children. This is the Black Hand, La Mano Nera, and in the first decade of the 20th century, it terrorizes every Italian neighborhood from New York to San Francisco. Detroit's version operates through loosely structured networks, more organized than pure chaos but far less centralized than New York's Morello Lupo operations. Multiple crews work the same neighborhoods, sometimes coordinating, often competing. The violence is frequent but not systematic. 3 different Black Hand groups might hit the same victim in the same week, each one threatening murder if payment goes to anyone else. The city's Italian population explodes from 3,000 in 1900 to over 30,000 by 1920. They cluster in narrow streets around Gratiot Avenue and St. Alban, in neighborhoods where English is rarely spoken and police are never trusted. Sicily's tradition of omertà, the code of silence, transplants perfectly to Detroit's immigrant quarters. When a store burns, no one saw anything. When a body appears in an alley with a black handprint carved into the chest, witnesses evaporate. This creates the perfect breeding ground for what comes next. The early extortionists work in small crews, but by 1910, a pattern emerges. Certain names appear repeatedly in police reports, always as suspects, never as defendants. Gaetano Gianola, Salvatore Catalanotte, Giovanni Vitale. These men understand something the freelance Black Hand artists don't. Chaos is expensive. Every random killing brings police attention. Every turf battle costs money. The real profit lies not in terrorizing immigrants, but in organizing them into a system where protection is guaranteed, silence is enforced, and everyone pays their share. Gianola begins unifying the scattered extortion crews on the east side. He's Sicilian, from the same Castellammare del Golfo province that produces so many of Detroit's immigrants, and he uses those hometown connections to build trust. His pitch is elegant. Pay us, and no one else will bother you. Refuse, and we can't protect you from the others. It's a protection racket that actually provides protection. From competitors, Genola quietly eliminates. By 1913, something resembling a criminal organization exists in Detroit. Not yet the Mafia, that formalization won't come for another 2 decades, but a loose confederation of Sicilian crews who respect territorial boundaries and share certain rackets. Genola's group controls the East Side Italian neighborhoods. Various Sicilian factions operate in different sections of the city. Their territories and leadership still fluid and contested. But it's still primitive, still violent. In 1919, Gaetano Genola is shot to death outside his home on St. Albans Street. His brother Giovanni takes over and immediately launches a war against the Vitali faction that leaves 16 men dead over 3 months. The police barely investigate. To them, dead Italians in Italian neighborhoods represent problems solving themselves. Then everything changes. January 16, 1920. The Volstead Act takes effect nationwide. The 18th Amendment prohibits the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages across the United States. In most American cities, this creates opportunity. In Detroit, it creates empire. The Detroit River is 3/4 of a mile wide at its narrowest point. On the American side, the nation's 4th largest city, home to Ford Motor Company, Chrysler, and General Motors, with hundreds of thousands of auto workers earning union wages and desperate for a drink. On the Canadian side, Windsor, Ontario, where liquor remains perfectly legal. Between them, a border so porous, so impossible to patrol, that it becomes the single most valuable smuggling corridor in North America. Within weeks of Prohibition's start, boats begin crossing the river every night. Small fishing vessels at first, carrying a few cases of Canadian whiskey, then larger craft. Speedboats with modified engines that can outrun Coast Guard cutters. In winter, when the river freezes, smugglers drive trucks directly across the ice, marking safe routes with lanterns and paying off the skeletal nighttime border patrol with cash that exceeds their yearly salaries. The money is staggering. A case of whiskey costs $4 in Windsor and sells for $40 in Detroit. In a single night, one boat making 3 trips can gross over $1,000. Multiply that by dozens of boats, hundreds of trips, and the Detroit River becomes a liquid highway generating millions of dollars in weekly revenue. But this treasure attracts predators. And in early 1920s Detroit, the most dangerous predators aren't Sicilian. They're Jewish, and they call themselves the Purple Gang. The Purple Gang emerges from Detroit's Lower East Side, a neighborhood so rough that even hardened criminals consider it a war zone. The core members grow up together in the streets near Hastings and Oakland. Abe Bernstein, the calculating strategist, his brothers Raymond, Isidore, and Joseph, each one more violent than the last. Harry and Sam, Sammy Purple Cohen. Eddie Fletcher, Harry Sutton. They start as teenage hijackers, robbing delivery trucks and shaking down shop owners. By the mid-1920s, they're the most feared criminal gang in Detroit. Where the Sicilian groups value secrecy, the Purple Gang thrives on reputation. They want people to know who hit that warehouse, who killed that rival bootlegger, who hijacked that shipment. Fear is their currency, and they spend it lavishly. The gang's name likely originated from a local shopkeeper or underworld associate who described them as purple, a slang term meaning spoiled, corrupted, or disreputable, due to their unpredictable violence. The name sticks. So does their method, extreme violence applied without warning or mercy. Between 1924 and 1928, the Purple Gang begins dominating bootlegging routes along the Detroit River. They don't negotiate. They don't offer partnerships. They simply kill competitors and seize their operations. When the Oakland Sugar House Gang tries to muscle in on Purple territory, 3 of their members are found shot to death in an alley. their bodies arranged in a neat row as a message. When bootlegger John Mirabella refuses to pay tribute, the Purple Gang corners him in a speakeasy on 12th Street and shoots him 23 times while 40 customers watch in silence. The gang also controls gambling operations, hijacking rackets, and the Cleaners and Dyers Union, extorting businesses and murdering union organizers who resist. They're making hundreds of thousands of dollars monthly, living in luxury, driving expensive cars, and acting like they'll rule Detroit forever. The Sicilian families watching this violence erupt across the city make a calculated decision. Let them. Let the Purple Gang be visible. Let them attract police attention and federal heat. Let them make enemies. The Sicilians will focus on building infrastructure, bribing dock workers, corrupting customs officials, establishing relationships with Canadian liquor exporters. When the Purple Gang eventually self-destructs, as violent gangs always do, the Sicilians will inherit a turnkey operation. This strategy requires patience, it requires discipline, and it requires a level of organizational sophistication that the Black Hand era never achieved. That sophistication arrives with Salvatore Sam Catalanotte. Catalanotte immigrates to Detroit from Partinico, Sicily, around 1912. Throughout the 1920s, he works quietly to unify Detroit's Sicilian factions. He's a mediator, a diplomat, a man who understands that the real enemy isn't other Italian criminals. It's disorder itself. Disorder brings police. Disorder makes business impossible. Disorder gets everyone arrested or killed. Catalanotte arranges marriages between families. He mediates disputes over territory. He establishes rules: no killing without approval from senior members, no hijacking shipments belonging to other Italian crews, no cooperation with police under any circumstances. These aren't revolutionary concepts. They're the basic structure of Cosa Nostra as practiced in Sicily and New York. But in Detroit, they represent a quantum leap in criminal organization. By 1925, something resembling a coherent Sicilian crime family exists in Detroit. Catalanotte serves as its unofficial leader, though he never uses the title boss. The family controls rum-running routes on the east side of the river, operates gambling dens in the Italian neighborhoods, and maintains a disciplined, low-profile approach to criminal enterprise. Meanwhile, the Purple Gang reaches its apex. The gang's alliance with Al Capone's Chicago outfit makes them nearly untouchable. They supply Capone with Canadian whiskey via Detroit, receiving protection and muscle in return. They're wrong. September 16, 1931, 1740 Collingwood Avenue. 3 members of the Purple Gang's Little Jewish Navy, Jaime Paul and Isidore Izzy the Rat Sutker, arrive at an apartment for what they believe is a peace conference with rival Purple Gang members. The internal split has been brewing for months. Abe Bernstein, the gang's strategic leader, has been trying to restrain his more violent lieutenants. But men like Ray Bernstein and Harry Keywell have their own ideas about how to run the organization. The 3 visitors climb the stairs to apartment 211. The door opens. They walk inside. Moments later, gunfire erupts. Shotguns and pistols fired at point-blank range. All 3 men die instantly, their bodies left sprawling on the apartment floor in a massacre that becomes known as the Collingwood Manor Massacre. The killers, Ray Bernstein, Harry Keywell, and Irving Milberg, are arrested within days. Witnesses finally talk. The code of silence that protected the Purple Gang shatters. In 1933, Bernstein and Keywell are convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The Purple Gang doesn't die immediately. It fragments with surviving members scattering to different rackets and different cities. But the organization that once terrified Detroit is finished. and the Sicilian crime family, which has been building its infrastructure quietly for a decade, steps into the void. But first, they have to survive a war that's tearing apart the entire American mafia. The Castellamarese War begins in New York in 1929, but its shockwaves reach Detroit almost immediately. The conflict pits two Sicilian factions against each other. Joe, the boss, Masseria, who represents the old guard of Italian-American organized crime, and Salvatore Maranzano, who champions a newer, more structured approach based on Sicily's traditional mafia families. The war is really about control, who runs the American Cosa Nostra, and what shape that organization takes. Detroit's Sicilian community is heavily Castellamarese. Many of the city's Italian immigrants come from Castellammare del Golfo and surrounding provinces in western Sicily. When Maranzano calls for support from Castellamarese factions across the country, Detroit responds. Sam Catalanot and his associates align with Maranzano. They're betting on the future, on organization over chaos, on structure over personality cults. The bet pays off. In April 1931, Masseria is assassinated during lunch at a Coney Island restaurant, shot to death by gunmen that include a young Charles Lucky Luciano. Maranzano declares victory and proclaims himself boss of bosses of the American Mafia. He organizes the scattered Italian crime groups into structured families, each with its own territory and leadership hierarchy. New York gets 5 families. Chicago, 1. Cleveland, Buffalo, Detroit. Each gets recognized as an official mafia family. In Detroit, the leadership structure that emerges is unique. Rather than a single boss dominating through force, 3 men form a triumvirate that will define the family's stability for decades. William Black Bill Taco, Giuseppe Joe Zerilli, and Angelo Meli. Taco, the eldest and most respected, is initially recognized by New York's commission as Detroit's official boss. But the arrangement is more sophisticated than a typical hierarchy. Taco, Zerilli, and Meli operate through consensus, each bringing different strengths to the organization. William Taco is the diplomat, the man with connections to both the old Castellamarese network and the newer American-born generation. His recognition as boss legitimizes Detroit's family in the eyes of the National Commission. But Taco understands something that many bosses don't. Longevity comes from sharing power, not hoarding it. Giuseppe Zerilli is the strategist, the man who thinks in decades rather than years. Born in Sicily in 1897, he immigrated to Detroit in 1912. He's quiet, almost invisible. Police have no photographs of him. Newspapers rarely mention his name. He doesn't own flashy cars or wear expensive suits. He lives modestly, maintains a legitimate job in the vending machine business, and never draws attention to himself. But his strategic vision, profit without publicity, will become the family's guiding philosophy. Angelo Meli, also born in Sicily in 1897, serves as underboss and the family's operational manager. Meli is even quieter than Zerilli. He conducts business in whispers at corner tables in Italian restaurants. But his organizational skills are exceptional. Meli manages the day-to-day operations, oversees policy gambling networks, and ensures that the family's rackets run smoothly and profitably. This triumvirate structure is revolutionary. In New York, bosses fight wars over succession. In Chicago, leadership changes through violence. In Philadelphia, internal conflicts destroy organizational capacity. Detroit's 3-man consensus prevents all of this. No single person controls enough power to act unilaterally. Every major decision requires agreement. This creates stability, continuity, and most importantly, prevents the kind of internal wars that bring federal attention and destroy criminal organizations. Over time, the arrangement evolves naturally. Taco, satisfied that the family is operating efficiently, gradually steps back from day-to-day leadership into a consigliere role, an elder advisor whose wisdom guides major decisions, but who doesn't manage operations. Zerilli assumes the formal title of boss, though he continues consulting Taco and Melli on all significant matters. Melli remains underboss, the man who translates strategic decisions into operational reality. This transition happens without violence, without conflict, without anyone getting killed. It's a succession that most mafia families would find impossible, and it sets the pattern for everything that follows. Zerilli's philosophy, now guiding the family officially, is simple: profit without publicity. He studies the mistakes of other mafia families and learns from their failures. In New York, bosses like Frank Costello and Albert Anastasia become celebrities. Their names in tabloids, their faces on television. They're eventually killed or imprisoned. In Chicago, the outfit's visibility brings constant federal pressure. In Philadelphia, internal wars between factions turn the city's family into a bloodbath. Detroit will be different. Detroit will be silent. The family operates primarily through East Side and West Side Sicilian factions, each with its own territory and specializations. The East Side Group, which Zerilli personally oversees with Melli's operational management, handles gambling operations, policy rackets, and certain labor unions. West Side operations, where families like the Giacalones will later emerge to prominence in the 1940s and 1950s, manage river-related activities and develop relationships with labor organizations. The family also maintains close relationships with Jewish associates, former Purple Gang members who stayed out of the Collingwood Massacre, who handle certain rackets in downtown Detroit. This structure prevents the kind of factional warfare that tears apart other families. No one crew is strong enough to challenge the triumvirate's authority alone. Every faction needs the others, and they all need the blessing of Taco, Zerilli, and Melli to operate. It's organizational genius disguised as simplicity. The family's core rackets in the 1930s are diverse and deeply profitable. Policy gambling, the illegal numbers lottery popular in black neighborhoods, generates consistent revenue with minimal police interference. Each morning, a number is drawn from stock market figures or horse race results. Bettors who pick the right three-digit combination win substantial payouts. The policy banks, controlled by the Detroit family, keep roughly 40% of all money wagered. With thousands of bets placed daily across the city's poorest neighborhoods, the profit is steady and reliable. Gambling dens operate in the back rooms of legitimate businesses across Italian neighborhoods. These aren't flashy casinos. They're card games and dice rooms where workers gamble their paychecks on Friday nights. The house takes a percentage of every pot. The family protects the games from police raids through a sophisticated bribery network that reaches into every precinct. When raids do occur, they're always telegraphed in advance. Gambling equipment disappears hours before police arrive. Arrests occur but are usually on minor charges. Major convictions are rare, though not non-existent. The family's legal protection is strong, but not absolute. Labor racketeering begins modestly, but will eventually become the family's most valuable asset. In the 1930s, Detroit is the center of American automobile manufacturing. Ford's River Rouge complex employs 100,000 workers. Chrysler, General Motors, Packard, the factories run around the clock, building the cars that will motorize America. Where there are workers, there are unions. And where there are unions, there are opportunities for men who understand how to profit from other people's labor. The Detroit family begins infiltrating local Teamsters chapters in the mid-1930s. The strategy is subtle. They don't try to take over the entire union. That would attract federal attention. Instead, they place trusted associates in strategic positions. A business agent here, a shop steward there. These men influence hiring decisions, control who gets the best routes, determine which companies face labor problems, and which ones run smoothly. Companies that cooperate with the family enjoy labor peace. Those that don't find themselves facing wildcat strikes, slowdowns, and mysterious equipment failures. The bribes flow systematically. Beat cops receive weekly envelopes, usually $15 to $20, enough to supplement their salaries, not enough to seem outrageous. Precinct sergeants get more. Detectives who might investigate organized crime receive the most, sometimes hundreds of dollars monthly, delivered through intermediaries at regular locations. Judges facing election find their campaigns suddenly well-funded by anonymous donors. Assistant prosecutors discover that certain cases attract negative publicity, while others offer opportunities for career advancement. This corruption network insulates the family from serious legal consequences throughout the 1930s. Arrests happen, usually on minor charges like gambling or disorderly conduct. Some cases result in convictions, typically with minimal sentences. But major prosecutions that might cripple the organization are rare. Witnesses recant, evidence disappears, prosecutors lose interest. The family's relationship with Chicago's outfit is carefully managed. Unlike the Purple Gang, which became a subordinate supplier to Capone, the Detroit Triumvirate insists on equality. Detroit isn't Chicago's satellite. It's an independent family that cooperates when cooperation benefits both parties. When outfit leaders need Canadian liquor, Detroit supplies it, at fair market prices. When Detroit needs help managing union matters in Chicago, the outfit provides muscle and influence. It's a partnership of equals, maintained through mutual respect and clear boundaries. This approach keeps Detroit out of the chaos that eventually consumes Chicago. When Elliot Ness and the Untouchables target Capone, Detroit stays out of the headlines. When the federal government brings down Frank Nitti, Detroit isn't mentioned. The city's mafia remains invisible, profitable, and growing. Prohibition ends in 1933, but the Detroit family barely notices. They've already diversified their revenue streams beyond bootlegging. The infrastructure, the boats, the bribed customs officials, the networks of drivers and distributors doesn't disappear. Instead, the family transitions focus to gambling operations, which explode across the city. Horse race betting, card games, dice rooms, and policy rackets become primary revenue sources. Some cigarette smuggling occurs, exploiting Michigan's higher tobacco taxes, but gambling and labor racketeering prove far more profitable and sustainable. The family also expands into legitimate businesses, though legitimate is a loose term. Vending machine companies, jukeboxes, cigarette distributorships. These businesses generate real revenue while also serving as money laundering operations for illegal gambling proceeds. The books show profit, taxes get paid, everything appears legal. Meanwhile, cash from policy gambling flows through these businesses, emerging clean on the other side. Throughout the 1930s and early 1940s, as war engulfs Europe and eventually draws America into global conflict, Detroit's mafia operates with machine-like efficiency. The Purple Gang's collapse becomes a cautionary tale that the Triumvirate references often. That's what happens when discipline breaks down. That's what happens when violence becomes random. That's what happens when loyalty means nothing. The Detroit family will be different. The Detroit family will last. December 8th, 1941. Pearl Harbor has been bombed. America enters World War II. Detroit transforms overnight into what President Roosevelt calls the arsenal of democracy. The automobile factories retool for military production. Ford builds B-24 bombers at the massive Willow Run plant. Chrysler manufactures tanks. General Motors produces aircraft engines, trucks, and ammunition. The city's population swells with workers from the South, both black and white, all desperate for factory jobs that pay union wages. For Detroit's Mafia, the war creates unprecedented opportunities. Defense contracts mean federal money flooding into the city. Military supply chains create choke points where organized crime can insert itself. Black market goods, rationed gasoline, tires, sugar, meat become valuable commodities. The gambling industry explodes as hundreds of thousands of workers, many of them young men far from home, seek entertainment in the city's bars and backroom casinos. But Zerilli and the triumvirate understand that wartime also brings danger. The federal government is watching Detroit carefully. The city is too important, its production too vital, to tolerate serious organized crime interference. So the family operates cautiously. They don't steal military supplies. They don't sabotage production. They don't create labor unrest that might slow the war effort. Instead, they provide services that factory workers want, gambling and alcohol. And they do it so smoothly that their operations never threaten the larger industrial machine. The family's infiltration of labor unions accelerates during the war. The United Auto Workers, formed in the 1930s through bitter strikes against the major manufacturers, has become one of the most powerful unions in America. UAW members work in every major auto plant in Detroit. They control hiring, working conditions, and the pace of production. For organized crime, influencing the UAW means influencing the entire city. The Detroit family doesn't try to take over the UAW's leadership. That would be too obvious, too risky. Instead, they cultivate relationships with specific local union officials, men who handle the day-to-day operations in individual factories. These relationships are built carefully, over years. A gambling debt here, a favor there, a business opportunity that seems legitimate but channels profits to the family. Eventually, certain union officials are so deeply compromised that they can't refuse family requests, even if they wanted to. But the real prize isn't the UAW. It's the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. The Teamsters Union, representing truck drivers and warehouse workers, is less prestigious than the UAW but potentially more powerful. Everything moves by truck. Auto parts, finished cars, retail goods, food, building materials. Control trucking, and you control commerce itself. In the 1940s, the Teamsters are still relatively small and fractured, with strong local chapters but weak national coordination. That's about to change thanks to a partnership between organized crime and a Detroit-born labor leader named James Riddle Hoffa. Hoffa grows up in Detroit's working-class neighborhoods, the son of a coal miner who died when Jimmy was 7. He drops out of school at 14 to support his family, working in a warehouse and then as a freight handler. In 1932, at age 19, he helps organize a strike against the Kroger grocery chain. The strike succeeds, and Hoffa discovers he has a talent for union organizing. Aggressive, fearless, willing to use violence when necessary. By 1940, Hoffa is president of Teamsters Local 299 in Detroit, one of the union's most important chapters. He is also developing relationships with the city's organized crime families. The relationship makes sense for both sides. Hoffa needs muscle to intimidate employers and rival union organizers. The Mafia needs influence over the Teamsters to control which companies face labor problems and which ones enjoy smooth operations. The alliance begins simply. When Hoffa faces resistance from employers, Detroit family associates provide intimidation, slash tires, vandalize trucks, threats delivered in whispers. When rival union organizers try to challenge Hoffa's control, those organizers find themselves beaten or, occasionally, disappeared. In return, Hoffa ensures that companies cooperating with the Detroit family enjoy labor peace. He also provides jobs for family associates as union officials, business agents, and trustees, positions that carry salaries, pensions, and influence. But the real innovation takes time to develop. In the late 1940s, the idea begins forming. What if union pension funds could be used for more than just retirement savings? Union pension funds are revolutionary in post-war America. Workers contribute a portion of their paychecks. Employers match those contributions. The accumulated money is supposed to provide retirement income for union members. But someone has to manage those funds. Someone has to decide how the money gets invested. And if that someone is corruptible, pension funds become something else entirely. The concept is there in the late 1940s, but the execution doesn't happen immediately. The Teamsters Central States, Southeast and Southwest Areas Pension Fund, the primary vehicle that will eventually fund organized crime's expansion, isn't truly consolidated and operational until the 1950s. The early experiments are small. Loans to businesses with mob connections, investments that provide kickbacks to union officials. But the scale is limited. The real transformation happens as Hoffa rises toward national leadership. By 1957, when Hoffa becomes general president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the pension fund scheme reaches its full potential. Now it's not just a Detroit operation. It's a national criminal bank accessible to multiple mafia families across the country. Chicago, Cleveland, Kansas City, Detroit. All benefit from what becomes one of the most successful financial frauds in American history. The mechanism is elegant. A mob associate wants to open a casino in Las Vegas, or build a shopping center in the Midwest, or expand a trucking company. Traditional banks won't lend to these people. They're criminals, or they have criminal connections, or their business plans are obviously fraudulent. But the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund will lend them money, usually at below-market interest rates and with minimal oversight. The loans rarely get repaid in full. Often, they're not repaid at all. But that doesn't matter, because the point isn't to generate investment returns for retired Teamsters. The point is to channel union members' retirement savings into businesses controlled by organized crime. The post-war boom transforms Detroit into one of America's most prosperous cities. The auto industry roars back to life, building cars for a nation desperate to modernize after years of wartime rationing. Factory workers earn middle-class wages. Suburban development spread across Oakland and Macomb counties. The city's population peaks at nearly 2 million. There's money everywhere, in workers' pockets, in corporate bank accounts, and union pension funds. The Detroit family extracts profit from every level. Their gambling operations expand into the suburbs. Policy gambling penetrates black neighborhoods on the city's north side. After-hours clubs cater to auto executives and traveling businessmen. Loan sharking, lending money at exorbitant interest rates to desperate gamblers and failing businessmen, becomes a major revenue source. The family even moves into legitimate real estate using shell companies to buy properties that are then rented or developed for profit. But they remain relatively invisible. National media covering organized crime focuses on New York, where bosses like Frank Costello testify before the Kefauver Committee's televised hearings on organized crime. Chicago's outfit makes headlines when Sam Giancana becomes boss. Philadelphia's family implodes in a bloody war. Detroit stays out of the newspapers. When the Kefauver Committee comes to Detroit in 1951, investigating organized crime across America, they find witnesses unwilling to talk and few pending investigations. The Detroit family is described vaguely as active, but not a significant problem. This relative invisibility is the triumvirate's greatest achievement. It's also their strategy for long-term survival. Let other families fight for headlines and prestige. Detroit will fight for profit and continuity. The Giacalone brothers emerge in the 1950s as major powers within the family. Vito, Billy Jack Giacalone, and his brother Anthony, Tony Jack Giacalone, represent the West Side faction's rise to prominence. Unlike the old triumvirate who shun any public presence, Tony Jack is comfortable moving in legitimate society. He owns a vending machine company, drives nice cars, belongs to social clubs. He golfs with businessmen and politicians. He attends charity events. To outsiders, he's a successful entrepreneur with some rough edges. To insiders, he's becoming the street boss, the man who manages day-to-day operations, solves problems, and insulates the official leadership from legal exposure. Vito Giacalone provides muscle when diplomacy fails. Vito is the enforcer, the man who delivers beatings, manages violent collections, and occasionally, very occasionally, handles murders. But even here, the Detroit family is disciplined. Murders are rare, approved only by senior leadership and executed professionally. Bodies don't show up in public places. Victims simply disappear, or their deaths are staged to look like accidents or robberies. The goal is always to avoid police attention, maintain the family's low profile, and eliminate problems without creating bigger ones. The family's national influence grows throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. The Teamsters Pension Fund, now fully operational under Hoffa's presidency, becomes their golden ticket. Detroit has interests in Las Vegas, where pension fund loans finance casino construction, the Stardust, the Fremont, the Desert Inn. They maintain relationships with crime families in Cleveland, Milwaukee, and Kansas City. They cooperate with New York families when opportunities for mutual profit arise, but they never subordinate themselves. Detroit remains independent, self-sufficient, and extraordinarily profitable. By 1960, the Detroit family is generating estimated millions annually from all sources. The money flows through dozens of businesses, gets laundered through legitimate enterprises, and enriches a select group of made members and trusted associates. The family's membership remains relatively small, perhaps 50 to 70 made members, but each one is carefully vetted, absolutely loyal, and committed to the triumvirate's vision of disciplined, profitable crime. Then federal pressure intensifies in ways the family hasn't experienced before. The late 1950s bring congressional scrutiny to organized labor and organized crime. The Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management, led by Senator John McClellan with Robert F. Kennedy as chief counsel, begins investigating corruption in American unions. Between 1957 and 1959, the committee holds televised hearings featuring testimony from union officials, employers, and alleged criminals. James R. Hoffa, who becomes general president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters in 1958, becomes one of the committee's primary targets. The televised confrontations between Kennedy and Hoffa are legendary. Two ambitious men locked in a battle of wills. Kennedy presses Hoffa about union corruption, about ties to organized crime, about the disappearance of money from Teamsters funds. Hoffa deflects, challenges Kennedy's authority, and barely conceals his contempt for the young prosecutor. For Detroit's Mafia, the hearings bring unwanted attention. Hoffa's visibility makes their profitable relationship with the Teamsters more dangerous. But Hoffa is too valuable to abandon. His control of the union gives organized crime families across the country access to pension funds, influence over commerce, and political power. The Detroit family continues supporting him through their influence, helping him navigate the congressional investigation. The strategy works, temporarily. Hoffa survives the Senate hearings without being indicted immediately. But the confrontation sets in motion a sequence of events that will eventually destroy Hoffa and bring unprecedented federal scrutiny to Detroit. In 1961, Kennedy becomes Attorney General under his brother, President John F. Kennedy. One of his first priorities is creating a special unit within the Justice Department dedicated to investigating Hoffa and the Teamsters. The Get Hoffa Squad, as it becomes known, includes federal prosecutors, FBI agents, and IRS investigators whose sole mission is building a criminal case against the union leader. The investigation is obsessive and thorough. Federal agents wiretap Hoffa's phones. They follow him constantly. They interview hundreds of witnesses, offering immunity deals and threatening obstruction charges. They examine Teamsters' financial transactions, looking for evidence of embezzlement, bribery, or pension fund fraud. They investigate Hoffa's relationship with organized crime, documenting meetings, phone calls, and financial transfers. For Detroit's Mafia, the federal heat is unprecedented. FBI surveillance teams begin watching Tony Giacalone, photographing his meetings with Hoffa and other union officials. Federal prosecutors subpoena Teamsters' records. Witnesses who once would never talk to authorities find themselves facing perjury charges if they don't cooperate. The family's response is characteristically patient. They don't retaliate against witnesses. They don't threaten federal agents. They don't do anything that would justify increased pressure. Instead, they simply continue operating carefully, quietly, waiting for the federal attention to shift elsewhere. It doesn't. In March 1964, Hoffa is convicted of jury tampering. In July 1964, he's convicted of defrauding the Teamsters Pension Fund. The cases are complex, the evidence overwhelming. Hoffa exhausts his appeals. On March 7, 1967, he surrenders to federal authorities and begins serving a 13-year sentence at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, by the mid-1960s, the triumvirate that built Detroit's stability is aging. William Black Bill Taco, the family's elder statesman and original boss, dies in 1964. His death marks the end of an era. Giuseppe Zerilli himself faces federal prosecution. In 1963, he's indicted for his role in the 1957 Appalachian meeting of mafia bosses. He's convicted in 1968 and spends much of the early 1970s in federal prison. During his absence, Angelo Mili and Tony Giacalone manage operations, but Zerilli's authority remains absolute even from behind bars. For the Detroit family, Hoffa's imprisonment could have been a disaster. Their most valuable asset is locked away, but the family has anticipated this possibility. Frank Fitzsimmons becomes acting president of the Teamsters when Hoffa goes to prison. Fitzsimmons is different from Hoffa, less confrontational, more willing to accommodate organized crime's interests, though not a complete puppet. Where Hoffa constantly pushed back against mob overreach, Fitzsimmons proves more cooperative, particularly with Midwest crime families. The pension fund loans continue under his leadership, though the degree of mob influence varies by region and project. The money flows generously during the late 1960s and early 1970s. The Teamsters Central States Pension Fund loans hundreds of millions of dollars to mob-connected businesses across multiple cities. Las Vegas casinos continue receiving Union Pension Fund financing. Shopping centers, hotels, and office buildings across the Midwest get built with Teamsters money. Detroit benefits from this system along with Chicago, Cleveland, Kansas City, and other families. Detroit's family profits substantially. Real estate projects in suburban Detroit receive favorable financing. Gambling operations expand. Construction rackets flourish. But internally, the family faces occasional tensions, disputes over territory, disagreements about strategy. These conflicts never escalate to violence, but the notion of perfect internal harmony is somewhat mythical. Zerilli's leadership, even from prison, keeps disputes contained. But there's a problem. Hoffa, sitting in federal prison, wants his job back. Prison changes Hoffa. He becomes more reflective but also increasingly paranoid about Fitzsimmons. He correctly suspects that his successor is too comfortable with organized crime influence. Hoffa begins maneuvering for early release, lobbying politicians, offering to reform the Teamsters. For Detroit's family leadership, this is concerning. Hoffa back in power means uncertainty. He knows too much about pension fund corruption. He might decide to reduce mob influence to save himself from further prosecution. He's become unpredictable and potentially dangerous. On December 23, 1971, President Richard Nixon commutes Hoffa's sentence with a specific condition. Hoffa is prohibited from participating in union activities until 1980. It's a strange condition likely inserted at the urging of Fitzsimmons and his allies, and it enrages Hoffa. He immediately begins challenging the restriction in court, arguing it's unconstitutional. For 4 years, Hoffa fights to regain his position. He files lawsuits, he rallies loyal Teamsters members. He publicly attacks Fitzsimmons and threatens to expose pension fund corruption. In private conversations, Hoffa makes clear he intends to reclaim the Teamsters presidency, though whether he plans a complete break with organized crime or simply wants to reassert his control over the relationship remains unclear. By mid-1975, according to later FBI investigations and informant testimony, Detroit family leaders have concluded that Hoffa represents a serious threat. He knows too much. He's too angry. He's too determined. And he might, if desperate enough, cooperate with federal authorities. July 30th, 1975, 2:45 p.m. Hoffa makes a phone call from a payphone outside the Meach's Red Fox restaurant. He reaches his wife Josephine and tells her the men he was supposed to meet haven't arrived. He sounds irritated but not alarmed. He says he'll wait a few more minutes and then drive home. Hoffa never makes it home. What happens next remains one of American history's most famous unsolved mysteries. The broad outline, reconstructed from FBI investigations and later informant testimony, suggests Hoffa was approached by someone he trusted while waiting in the parking lot. This person convinced him to get into a vehicle, possibly saying the meeting location had changed or that Tony Giacalone was waiting nearby. Hoffa got in the car, and somewhere in the hours that followed, James Riddle Hoffa was murdered. Multiple theories exist about what happened. FBI investigations and informant statements suggest various scenarios: that Hoffa was driven to a house in suburban Detroit, that he was confronted and killed, that his body was disposed of through various means. The body has never been found despite extensive searches, excavations, and investigations spanning nearly 5 decades. Various theories about the body's final location have emerged. Some suggest cremation at a mob-connected facility. Others claim burial at a landfill or construction site. Still others propose industrial disposal. The truth remains unknown. What's clear is that the disposal was thorough enough that the body has never been recovered. Tony Giacalone's alibi is documented. On July 30th, he was at the Southfield Athletic Club, with witnesses placing him there during the relevant time frame. Other potential suspects, Detroit family members, Teamsters officials with mob connections, and various associates, either have alibis or have refused to talk. The FBI investigation is extensive. Agents interview hundreds of witnesses. They search properties across Michigan and Ohio. They offer immunity deals to potential cooperators. But the Detroit family's culture of silence holds. No direct evidence surfaces. The investigation produces theories and probabilities, but never proof sufficient for murder charges. Hoffa is declared legally dead in 1982. The case remains open. The Detroit family faces intensified FBI surveillance following the disappearance. Grand juries investigate. Prosecutors seek indictments for obstruction and perjury. But without a body, without cooperative witnesses, without direct evidence, murder charges never materialize. Some lower-level associates eventually face charges for lying to federal agents, but these result in minor sentences that don't damage the family's core structure. Frank Fitzsimmons remains president of the Teamsters until his death in 1981. His successor, Jackie Presser, proves to be a complex figure, secretly serving as an FBI informant while simultaneously maintaining relationships with organized crime figures. The pension fund corruption continues until federal oversight finally imposes reforms in the late 1980s. By then, hundreds of millions of dollars have been diverted from Teamsters' retirement savings. Giuseppe Zerilli, released from federal prison in the early 1970s, continues leading the family until his death in October 1977. He's 80 years old, having guided the Detroit family through 4 decades of prohibition, war, prosperity, and federal pressure. Despite his lengthy imprisonment in the 1960s, his total time as recognized boss spans over 40 years, one of the longest tenures in Mafia history. The transition is planned carefully. Tony Giacalone has been functioning as street boss, managing day-to-day operations. Jack Tacco, son of William Black Bill Tacco and inheritor of his father's diplomatic skills and strategic thinking, has risen through the ranks to become underboss. When Zerilli dies, the succession is seamless. There are no internal wars, no challenges to the new leadership, no chaos. Giacalone and Tocco formally assume control. This succession, accomplished without violence or disruption, demonstrates Detroit's exceptional stability, even as other families across the country tear themselves apart in succession battles. The family structure under the new leadership remains fundamentally unchanged. East Side and West Side factions continue cooperating under centralized authority. Gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and pension fund manipulation remain core activities. Violence is used sparingly and professionally. Discipline, though not absolutely perfect, remains strong. The late 1970s and 1980s should be stable years for Detroit. Their rackets are mature and profitable. Federal law enforcement is focused heavily on New York families. The Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese families attract far more attention. The Sicilian community that forms the family's core remains largely loyal. But the world is changing in ways that will eventually threaten even Detroit's disciplined organization. The RICO Act, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, becomes law in 1970, but its full implications don't become clear until the 1980s. RICO allows prosecutors to target entire criminal organizations rather than individual criminals. Instead of proving that a specific person committed a specific crime, prosecutors can show that an organization exists to commit crimes and then charge all its members with racketeering. The penalties are severe: 20 years in federal prison, massive fines, forfeiture of all assets derived from criminal activity. In the early 1980s, federal prosecutors begin using RICO to devastate mafia families across America. The Colombo family in New York loses its entire leadership. The Lucchese family is crippled by the commission trial. The Gambino family's boss, Paul Castellano, is murdered in 1985, and his successor, John Gotti, eventually goes to prison for life after RICO convictions. Detroit watches this national crackdown with growing concern. But the family's structure, smaller membership, disciplined operations, low profile initially protects them. RICO cases require extensive documentation. They need witnesses, wiretaps, financial records showing criminal activity. Detroit's family generates fewer of these than larger, flashier organizations. Their murders are rare and professionally executed. Their communications are careful. Their financial operations are laundered through legitimate businesses. But the FBI's Detroit office begins assembling a case. Agents photograph family members at known mob hangouts. They document meetings, track money flows, identify legitimate businesses functioning as fronts. They cultivate potential informants, lower-level associates who might be convinced to testify. They tap phones, not of the senior leadership, but of soldiers and associates whose conversations occasionally reference higher-ups. Jack Taco formally becomes boss in the late 1970s after Zerilli's death. Born in 1927, he represents a new generation. He's more educated than typical mob bosses and understands that the old methods need adaptation. The Teamsters connection is weakening as federal oversight of pension funds increases. Gambling faces competition from state lotteries and legal casinos. Labor racketeering still works, but unions are declining as manufacturing jobs leave Detroit. Taco diversifies. The family moves deeper into construction rackets, rigging bids for public works projects. They expand sports betting operations. They move cautiously into drug distribution through associates, though never as a primary activity. Drugs attract federal attention, and Detroit has always avoided high-risk rackets. The family's operations in the 1980s and early 1990s are less profitable than their peak decades, but they're still generating substantial income. Membership has declined to perhaps 30 to 40 made members, plus a larger network of associates. The discipline that made Detroit stable for decades remains largely intact, though some internal disputes arise over strategy and territory. None escalate to violence. Then the inevitable happens. In 1996, federal prosecutors indict Jack Taco and 17 other Detroit family members on RICO charges. The indictment alleges that the Detroit family is a continuing criminal enterprise engaged in illegal gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and racketeering. The case is built on years of surveillance, some witness testimony, and extensive documentation of criminal activity. The trial is lengthy and complex. Prosecutors present evidence of gambling operations, describe the family's structure, and show financial records proving that legitimate businesses are mob fronts. Defense attorneys argue that the government is criminalizing Italian-American social clubs, that the evidence is circumstantial, that witnesses are unreliable criminals seeking lighter sentences. In 1998, Taco is convicted along with several associates. He's sentenced to over 10 years in federal prison. Other family members receive shorter sentences. The conviction seriously damaged Detroit's leadership structure, removing experienced leaders during a critical transition period. But here's what's remarkable. The Detroit family doesn't collapse. Unlike Philadelphia, where RICO prosecutions triggered internal wars, Detroit maintains its structure. Acting bosses step up. Younger members assume responsibilities. The rackets continue at reduced capacity but remain functional. This resilience proves the strength of the organizational model built by the original triumvirate. Taco, Zerilli, and Melli created an institution so systematically structured that it could survive even the removal of top leadership. Families that collapsed in the 1990s were personality-based organizations. When the boss fell, everything fell. Detroit was institutional. It could lose bosses and continue. Taco is released from federal prison in 2008. He's 81 years old, facing health problems, and the world has changed drastically. The Detroit family is much smaller. Estimates suggest 15 to 25 made members. The rackets that sustained them for decades are either obsolete or too risky. The FBI has perfected RICO prosecutions. Electronic surveillance captures conversations. Witnesses are easier to flip. But the family still exists. They operate quietly in construction, rigging bids and extorting contractors. They run sports betting operations adapted for internet gambling. They loan money to desperate businessmen and addicted gamblers. They have connections in legitimate businesses, restaurants, waste disposal, real estate that generate both legal income and money laundering opportunities. Jack Taco dies in July 2014. His death removes the last direct link to the family's golden age. The current leadership, names mostly unknown to federal investigators or the public, represents a generation far removed from the triumvirate that built the organization. Modern Detroit is a city in crisis. The auto industry that made it wealthy has declined catastrophically. The population has dropped from nearly 2 million at its peak to under 700,000. Neighborhoods are abandoned. The tax base has eroded. In 2013, Detroit becomes the largest American city ever to file for bankruptcy. But the Mafia family survives. It's smaller, weaker, less profitable than at any point since the 1930s, but it still functions. FBI reports from the 2010s and 2020s still identify the Detroit family as an active, organized crime organization. Current estimates suggest perhaps 10 to 15 made members plus associates. They maintain relationships with other families. They still operate under the same basic structure established by Taco, Zerilli, and Melli nearly a century ago. This endurance is extraordinary. Most American Mafia families either collapsed entirely or exist only as shadows. Detroit, despite losing almost everything, their Teamsters connection, their gambling monopoly, their political protection, their wealth, remains functional. Their survivors, adapted to hostile environments, persistent through every change in circumstances. The Detroit River flows, as it always has, dark water moving between two countries, indifferent to the empires built on its banks and the men who profited from its crossing. The boats that once carried Canadian whiskey are gone, replaced by legitimate cargo ships and recreational vessels. The speakeasies are closed. The Purple Gang is dead. Jimmy Hoffa's body has never been found. The factories are quiet or demolished. The unions are weak. The Teamsters pension fund is under federal control. But in small social clubs in suburban Detroit, in Italian restaurants in Macomb County, in construction company offices and waste disposal businesses, men who never discuss their actual business still meet quietly. They share information. They make decisions. They maintain an organization that has outlasted every comparable institution in the city's history. How did they do it? How did a Sicilian crime family in Detroit become one of the most enduring mafia organizations in American history? The answer lies in 4 principles that the original triumvirate understood and that subsequent generations maintained, even imperfectly. First, relative stability of leadership through consensus. The Taco Zerilli Melli triumvirate created a power-sharing arrangement that prevented succession wars. Even when formal leadership transitioned from Taco to Zerilli, from Zerilli to the Giacalone-Taco partnership, It happened through consensus rather than violence. Zerilli's tenure as boss, despite his imprisonment in the 1960s, provided continuity that most families lacked. This stability allowed long-term planning impossible in organizations where bosses are murdered every few years. Second, control of labor, especially the Teamsters. The pension fund scheme that fully matured in the late 1950s and peaked in the 1960s gave Detroit national importance far exceeding its size. Other families had gambling or drugs or protection rackets. Detroit had influence over America's transportation system and access to hundreds of millions of dollars in pension funds. This made them essential partners for other families and generated enormous wealth with manageable risk. Third, relative avoidance of internal wars. Detroit never had a Castellamare-style internal civil war or a dramatic boss assassination. While not perfectly harmonious, disputes and tensions existed. The family's internal discipline prevented the kind of chaos that brings federal attention and destroys organizational capacity. When violence was necessary, it was rare and professional. This discipline made them resistant to the informant culture that devastated other families. Fourth, discipline and relative silence. For decades, very few Detroit family members cooperated with authorities. The culture of omerta was strong, though not absolute. This made building RICO cases extraordinarily difficult. Without extensive witness testimony describing the family's inner workings, prosecutors had to rely heavily on surveillance and circumstantial evidence. By the time they finally assembled successful cases in the 1990s, the family had already enjoyed 6 decades of profitable operation. These principles distinguish Detroit from more volatile families. Most mafia organizations operated on personality, on respect earned through violence, on the principle that power comes from fear. Detroit understood that power comes from structure, from consensus, from discipline, from thinking in decades rather than years. They watched the Purple Gang burn bright and collapse. They watched Capone dominate Chicago and die imprisoned. They watched New York families tear themselves apart. They watched Philadelphia descend into chaos. They watched every flashy, violent, personality-driven organization either collapse or face prosecution. And they stayed relatively quiet. They stayed organized, they stayed profitable longer than almost any comparable family. The irony is profound. Detroit, the city built on industrial innovation, on Henry Ford's assembly line, produced a criminal organization that was itself a model of organizational efficiency. The same principles that made Ford Motor Company productive made the Detroit Partnership enduring. Clear hierarchy, division of labor, standardized procedures, long-term planning, and operational efficiency built on consensus rather than autocracy. William Black Bill Tocco, Giuseppe Zerilli, and Angelo Melli never gave newspaper interviews, never appeared on television, never wrote memoirs. Most Americans who lived through their leadership never heard their names. They built an organization out of relative invisibility and shared power, proving that in organized crime, as in legitimate business, the most successful operators are often the ones nobody notices, and the ones who understand that shared leadership prevents the internal conflicts that destroy organizations from within. The Detroit family story is a crime saga, but it's also an American story. A story of immigrants who brought old world traditions to a new world city. A story of men who saw opportunity in chaos and built structure from violence. A story of an organization that adapted, endured, and survived against odds that destroyed almost every comparable institution. The factories are gone. The unions are broken. The Teamsters serve their members now. The pension funds are protected. The gambling is increasingly legal. The political machine has been replaced by federal oversight. The Sicilian neighborhoods have been demolished or transformed. But the organization persists, smaller, weaker, operating in shadows of shadows, but still there, still meeting, still making decisions, still generating income, even if measured in thousands instead of millions. Jimmy Hoffa's body has never been found. That single fact captures the essence of what made Detroit's Mafia formidable. They could make the most famous union leader in America disappear so completely that 50 years of investigation never produced a corpse. They could commit the most famous mob hit in American history and never face murder charges. They could operate for over 90 years in one of America's most important cities, while remaining largely invisible to the public, living alongside them. The Detroit River still flows. The water is cleaner now than in 1920. The border is more secure. The city is smaller, struggling to reinvent itself. But some things endure. Some institutions outlast the circumstances that created them. In the end, the Detroit Mafia didn't lose everything. They lost their power, their wealth, their political protection, and their invisibility. But they kept what mattered most to their core identity, a structure built on consensus rather than autocracy, a degree of discipline, and their survival. The triumvirate would recognize what remains. They built an organization designed not to dominate, but to endure. And nearly 95 years after they consolidated power, despite every force arrayed against them, despite the death of every original member, despite the destruction of the city that gave them birth, they still exist in some form. That's the real story of Detroit's Mafia. Not that they built an empire, but that they built something extraordinarily difficult to kill completely. In a world where criminal organizations usually last a generation before collapsing in blood and betrayal, they created something spanning nearly a century. They didn't conquer Detroit. They became part of it, a shadow institution as persistent as the river itself, flowing quietly beneath the surface of American life, invisible to most, weakened but unbroken, nearly forgotten but never truly gone. The men who remember the triumvirate are dead. The men who knew Jimmy Hoffa are dead or imprisoned. The city they influenced has transformed beyond recognition, but the organization persists in diminished form, adapted to a new century, stripped of most power but retaining basic structure, proving one final time the principle that sustained it. In organized crime, as in nature, survival isn't about being the strongest or the richest or the most feared. It's about being disciplined enough, patient enough, and adaptable enough to outlast everything trying to destroy you. The Detroit Partnership accomplished exactly that. And in the ruthless calculus of criminal enterprise, that makes them one of the most remarkable case studies in the history of American organized crime.